Listen to AM 560 The Answer online at 560theanswer.com, on the AM 560 mobile app, on your Alexa-powered smart speaker, and on TuneIn, iHeart, and on Odyssey. This is Chicago's Morning Answer with Dan Proft and Amy Jacobson on AM 560 The Answer.
Top of the morning, Dan and Amy. Joe Biden in Poland went off script, and what happened is what usually happens. He went off the rails, suggesting that U.S. policy is now regime change in Russia.
For God's sake, this man cannot remain in power. God bless you all, and may God...
And that brought Biden administration officials out for the Sunday talk shows, actually even before the Sunday talk shows with Tony Blinken in Jerusalem.
President Putin cannot be empowered to wage war or engage in aggression against Ukraine or anyone else. As you know, and as you've heard us say repeatedly, we do not have a strategy of regime change in Russia.
And this was the rinse and repeat all weekend. U.S. Ambassador to the UN, Julianne Smith, on This Week.
Well, let me be clear and just state right off the bat that the U.S. does not have a policy of regime change towards Russia. But I think what we all agree on is that President Putin cannot be empowered to wage war.
Mm-hmm. Something else Joe Biden said in a visit to some members of the 82nd Airborne on his trip that has not been walked back as far as I've heard. Rather curious statement he made, considering our stated policy is no ground troops in Ukraine.
And you're going to see when you're there, and some of you have been there, you're going to see women, young people stand in the middle in front of a damn tank, just saying, I'm not leaving. I'm holding my ground. They're incredible.
So the 82nd Airborne has been there. They're going there. What exactly is the administration policy with respect to ground troops? For more on all this, pleased to be joined by our friend Lieutenant Colonel Jim Carafano for our weekly confab. He's the vice president of the Catherine and Shelby Cullum Davis Institute for International Studies at the Heritage Foundation and author of Brutal War, Jungle Fighting, Papua New Guinea, 1942. Jim?
Well, the president, the White House did actually walk back the president's comment about the 82nd Airborne going to Ukraine. He did say, but the two you mentioned were one of about a half a dozen just wrong statements that the president made, which kind of got everybody kind of mind-boggling. And look, it's just a reminder. I mean, let's just be honest. And you know me, I'm not a Republican, so this is not, this is not a president at the top of his cognitive skills. I mean, let's just be honest with all ourselves about that. And that's the reason why we're getting these comments. I mean, no person goes out on the most important foreign policy trip of your lifetime in a career of 40 years of political service when everything he says never mattered more. And the whole purpose of the trip is to send very clear messages and to literally have, gaffe after gaffe that's just not what a person who is fully at the top of their game would do. But to me, the bigger issue there is look, it's not just the president. I mean, it would be different if we had a president who was, trailing in his years, but he's surrounded by a team that's, I mean, the kindest thing I can say is they're just subpar. These are the same people that were under Obama, and they're not very good. And, if you think that what's going on in Ukraine and this trip kind of made you nervous, they're getting ready to sign an Iran deal with Iran. People say it's days away. It only benefits Iran. It's probably going to trigger a war with Israel. And if it doesn't do that, it's probably going to trigger nuclear proliferation in the Middle East. And the fallout from this deal is going to be so bad that it's going to make Afghanistan and Ukraine look like a good thing. And this is not just the president who's hell-bent to do this. This is his entire team. So we have a governance problem. I think we've learned that, because if you actually look in this particular crisis, and even everything the president did on this trip, look, it's very clear this president's not leading. he is going along with what everybody else wants to do, and then he's saying that's leading. And the most telling statement that I heard in those clips you just played is somebody said, "Well, we don't have a strategy of regime change."
Yeah,
Well,
that was
true.
the Secretary of State, by the way.
Because they don't have a strategy.
Yeah.
Right, but I thought,
At all.
well, I thought Biden, because they put things in the prompter and he reads it. He went off script and said that about a regime change in Russia. So
Yeah, but the point is they don't have a strategy, and it's not just for this. They don't have a strategy for anything. The first thing they kicked out the door was a national gender strategy. They still don't have a national security strategy, and that's supposed to guide the presidency. They're almost halfway through the presidency, and they haven't produced a document yet. And the dirty little secret in Washington is they drafted a document, and then Ukraine happened, and they realized it's so weak and milquetoast that it was an embarrassment, and they had to pull it back and redo it. And now the White House is afraid to release it because they're afraid that people will criticize them for it.
Well, and for clarity's sake, these gaffes, the two we've been discussing, the regime change and the 82nd Airborne, they're important because they play into the propaganda of one Vlad Putin to say the West is out to get me. They're out to take out the head of state. They're saying they're not sending ground troops to Ukraine, and they're doing that. So it just plays into his line of propaganda for his people and other enemies of America.
Well, I know the gas make a lot of news and everything, but the reality is what the Russians and the Chinese and the Iranian, and indeed all our friends and allies do, is they pay attention to what we do, not what we say. This administration is about saying, about talking points, about excuses, about saying. They don't do. And that is really the real problem. So the two things that make Putin a threat, as an example, are his military, which, okay, maybe they're not efficient, but they're really good at killing innocent people, and energy blackmail. And you heard nothing on the president's trip to talk about how we're going to rebuild our defenses so we can deal with both Putin and China, and how are we going to provide reliable, abundant, affordable energy. I mean, he made this nonsense about, okay, well, everything's going to be done by renewables. Well, the physics of that just don't work, and everybody knows it. And so it just what really worries people, and not the gas, is that they don't have a strategy, and this is an unserious president. And this does worry our allies. Before in public, people used to say terrible things about Donald Trump, and then they go back and say, well, we have to say that because our voters don't like Trump, and so we said nice things about him. But we actually think his policies are quite sensible. It's the opposite. World leaders and governments say nice things about Biden in public, but in private they go, oh my God, this guy is not the leader of the free world. And that's, again, it's not meant to be a partisan mean comment, and it's not meant to be that the United States should be the world's policeman or anything. It's just that nobody thinks that Biden is leading America to look after America's own interests.
Well, on the energy policy piece, I mean, it's just as simple as this, the ridiculousness of it all. They make a big announcement that the U.S. is going to help Europe replace Russia as its natural gas supplier. Meanwhile, he's continuing to try and put natural gas out of business in this country.
Look, I mean, the reality is you cannot power the world on renewables. You cannot have a reliable grid in an industrialized world. You cannot bring developing nations out of poverty. You cannot deliver reliable electricity to people that have never had it based on renewables. It's not. And even if you could, it's not going to get you to net zero by 2050. And even if you could, it's all subsidized, which means that it's going to be incredibly expensive and impoverish the country. And it's also not even good for the environment. I mean, if you look at the life cycle costs of many of these green technologies like cars, they actually have a higher carbon footprint than fossil fuels do. So it literally is nonsense. And in the middle of a global crisis, for a leader of the free world to stand up and say, and we're going to solve all this with magical thinking, that doesn't give anybody confidence.
Now, what is the latest, though? Between Zelensky, he's offering a bit of an olive branch to Putin, and then there's talk of Putin wanting a similar to Korea, a North Korea and a South Korea.
Well, look. I mean, the advantage of a South Korea is South Korea can defend itself, and however this ends, if at the end if Ukraine doesn't have both the right and the capacity and the ability to defend itself, to deter Putin in the future, this is just a crisis before the next crisis. So, I mean, Zelensky has two challenges. One is you never deal with the Russians from a position of weakness, because then you're just negotiating from surrender. So he has to deal with Putin from a position of strength, and a position of strength is demonstrably proving on the battlefield that Russia cannot win this war. That's one. And then the second thing, when he cuts a deal, if that deal doesn't allow Ukraine to defend itself in the future, then Putin will just come back. Will go back and be back again to get the rest of it.
If he is able to get Mariupol and essentially have that land bridge between Crimea and those quote unquote breakaway republics in the east, and that's a concession that is made by Zelensky in any sort of negotiation, does it put Putin in that very situation of delayed victory that you're describing?
Well, I mean, again, it goes on what rights and capacity does Ukraine have to defend itself in the future. I mean, you can look. I mean, the reality is the Ukrainians are about to experience what the Russians did, which is that there are some inherent advantages for the defender. So when the Russians go on the defense, I mean, it'll be very, very tough for the Ukrainians to root them out of some of these places. And the reality is this conflict could get to a cessation of a hostility to a point in which Russia is still occupying Ukrainian territory. And there's probably nothing the Ukrainians would be able to do about that. But this is a situation, I think, not South Korea, North Korea, but more analogous to East Germany and West Germany. You know, when the conflict ended, you know, West Germany was separated from East Germany, but West Germany never relinquished that Germany was one sovereign country, and just because part of it was occupied by somebody else, that wasn't legitimately part of Germany. And I think, however this ends, if there is Ukrainian territory which is occupied by Russia, Ukrainians, I wouldn't think in a deal would ever say, okay, we give you that part of the country. They would always say, they would just not acknowledge that it was, they would accept that it was occupied, but they wouldn't accept that the sovereignty had been transferred. And I think that would be, I think that would be, for Zelensky, a political problem. If you think about it, 40 million Ukrainians have fought, a quarter of them have been displaced, they've been dying, they've been fighting, their countries are being ravaged. They are fighting for their country, and for the president to just say, okay, yeah, I'm just going to give away part of my country, that's going to be hard for him to do, I think.
So then where are things right now? You know, we hear conflicting stories. We hear Russia is moving troops from Georgia up to Ukraine.
Right.
We hear Russia is pivoting away from Kyiv, conceding they can't take Kyiv, and they're continuing to pound Mariupol to establish that land bridge I just mentioned. Where do you see Putin's strategy right now, his horizon, and how are things going?
Well, again, this is based on somebody who's a couple thousand miles from the battlefield, trying to make sense out of the same stuff that you guys are seeing. I think there are two things that seem apparent. One is the Russians are trying to consolidate their control in the south, which is the strategically more important part of the country. That's not surprising. I think the other thing is look, these guys can fight forever if they want to. I mean, Ukrainians, as long as they continue to get medical supplies and food and arms and ammunition from the West, they can continue to fight, and the Russians can fight forever. I mean, Putin can go back to Russia, get more stuff, and come back again. So I think the answer is this conflict continues as long as the two sides are willing to fight, and I think the two sides are going to fight until they get to a position on the battlefield that they think is acceptable for them. So at some point, I think this will drift off into a frozen conflict. That's today. What we know today about the information that we have today. So that's the best I can tell you. And I will say this: I don't think even if Putin introduced chemical or nuclear weapons, tactical nuclear weapons, I don't think that changes because the Russians don't really have the capacity to exploit the use of them in a military significant way. They just be to kind of punish the Ukrainian people. But it would also more isolate the Russians. So I just don't see how this ends on the battlefield.
This,
if you know what I mean.
Yeah, Yeah, I hear you. But so then this talk and some of the reporting about the potential of palace intrigue and coups afoot, and you've got a couple of the oligarchs like Deripaska publicly criticizing the uh, the invasion. Does that amount to anything with respect to Putin's regime?
We don't know, but on the Russian side, I said, look, here is a guy who's been in power for decades, who's an ex-KGB agent, who, if somebody was going to stab them in the back, he'd already stabbed them in the back. So the possibility that Putin would put himself in a position to be vulnerable enough to be taken out doesn't seem realistic to me. Conversely, Zelensky has demonstrated remarkable ability to hold governance and to keep this together and keep himself physically safe. So those things happen in history. I mean, they happen all the time. But if you're planning the defense of your country or the future, you just can't count on them.
One more thing, going back to that Iran deal. I mean, when you make a statement like this, the implications will be far more deleterious to peace in the West than Afghanistan, than Ukraine. Explain that. Why are you so cynical about the implications?
Because this deal is so weak, it literally unleashes Iran on the West. It not only unleashes Iran on the West, but it becomes a complete open backdoor for the Russians to bypass sanctions. And so you're going to have a very empowered, very dangerous Iran, and very close to a nuclear weapon. And the most likely scenario is that there's an Iran-Israeli war. The Israelis try to take out the Iranian nuclear infrastructure. And it won't just be a war between Iran and Israel, because there's a bunch of countries in between. And so it'll be a pretty broad regional war. And if for some reason the Israelis don't do that, what's very likely to what's going to happen is the Turks and the Egyptians and the Saudis will all want nuclear weapons, because there is nobody's defending them. And so they'll want nuclear weapons to counter Iran, and you'll have a very, very dangerous situation. That's almost, and how it doesn't lead to a regional conflict, and maybe even the exchange of nuclear weapons becomes unthinkable. So we're about to trade kind of an untenuous situation for something that could be far, far worse.
Has there been a paradigm shift in establishment foreign policy thinking in the last 20 years? And the reason I ask that is because I was watching a clip over the weekend from an appearance by Biden, McCain, and Dole on Meet the Press in '99, where
Right.
Those were the three that wanted us to go to Belgrade. NATO troops, tell the Americans they're going to be casualties. We're going in to stop the Milosevic genocide in the Balkans. And nobody is seriously suggesting anything of the sort with respect to Ukraine, not to mention China, not to mention Myanmar. Has there been a change?
Well, I think there has, and I do think it's Donald Trump. I mean, I think between Obama and Bush, we saw the two extremes of those impulses. Under Bush, it was this very muscular foreign policy of let's go out there and kind of solve all our problems, and people saw what that led to in Afghanistan and Iraq. And Obama was the polar opposite, much like Biden. It was let's disengage from the world and take away the safety net and hope bad things don't happen. And then people say, well, bad people just fill that vacuum that you leave behind. And what Donald Trump said is let's go back to something that's actually much more fundamental, which is defending America's interests. And let's lean forward and demonstrate to our adversaries that we are willing to defend our interests. We don't care about regime change. We don't care about nation building. We don't care about making the world safe for democracy, but we're going to defend our interests, and that actually turns out to be in the best interest of our friends and allies as well. So we're going to demonstrate that willingness and force our enemies to back down, but we're not going to go out and try to, save the world. And I think that balance proved not just workable, but I think the vast majority of Americans like that. People forget, regardless of what you think about the election in 2020. That was not about foreign policy. And Trump didn't lose a vote because people wanted a different foreign policy. The reason why we have such Manichaean black and white foreign policies is because the Republican and Democratic parties are much more ideologically pure, and foreign policy no longer stops at the water's edge. People just carry their politics into the future. And the difference is Republicans are basically realists who want to do what's fundamentally good for the country, and Democrats are basically idealists and they want to transform the world. And And we're going to continue to see that in the future, I think, is when we shift from Republican control to Democrat and back and forth, our foreign policy is going to flip on a dime, and it's probably going to drive everybody in the world crazy. But there you are.
Lieutenant Colonel Jim Carafano, VP of the Catherine and Shelby Cullum Davis Institute for International Studies at the Heritage Foundation. The book, Brutal War, Jungle Fighting, Papua New Guinea, 1942. Thank you, as always, Jim.
And he joined us on our turnkey.pro answer line.
The stories you need to know to